normally about this time, Martin Devlin talks to Justin Marshall, but he's gone MIA. I'm not sure where he is, but the old story in rugby, if you can't have Marshall, you just have to make do with Nisbett. He's with me now, Grant Nisbett. Good afternoon to you.
G'day, Telf. I'm good, thank you, mate.
Not trying to suggest you in any way a secondary to Justin Marshall, but anyway, nice to talk to you and talk some rugby. Can I just get your take on this business with the Sevens? I just had a discussion with Joseph Romanis. We both agree that the performance of the men at this Olympic Games is a wake-up call, or must act as a wake-up call to the New Zealand Rugby Union, that you can no longer send a team largely made up of players who, I must confess in my case, I'd hardly heard of any of these names, and think that that's good enough to be sending to the Olympic Games, because Sevens has now become a global sport, whether the New Zealand Rugby Union likes it or not. And I think France have shown that you don't necessarily have to sacrifice 15s rugby by sending good players to the Sevens. Why can't we do that?
Yeah, good point, Telf. I think we've always... well, actually, when you go right back to the start of it all, we had guys like Zinzan Brook and I think even Buck Shelford.
Yeah,
and a few
Christian
fairly
Cullen, Jonah Longley. Yeah.
Yes, we did. And things have changed over the years. Players have decided, rightly or wrongly, that they'd be Sevens players and Sevens players only. But as you say, certainly France with Antoine Dupont, and Australia, I noticed, had a couple of Super Rugby players. Corey Toole was playing, and Mark Nitawasi, who's going to Rugby League next year, he was playing in their team as well. And of course, they flirted with Michael Hooper, even though he didn't make the team. So, yes, I think you're probably right. I think maybe it needs a rethink at the top echelons of New Zealand rugby.
Yeah, I mean, it's not rocket science here, is it? I mean, you talk about specialist Sevens players. Yes, there's an adjustment that has to be made for sure, but fundamentally you're playing exactly the same game, aren't you? On the same size field with the same ball, without half the number of players. So I don't think that's a major issue. What I think could be something that's worth looking at is the role here of World Rugby. I mean, cricket have had exactly the same problem, if you like, with the IPL in India, haven't they? The T20 competition, which has dominated world cricket, and in the end, the ICC have had no choice, whether they like it or not, but to accommodate the T20 coming out of India. So there is no real tours scheduled during those 6 weeks of cricket. Maybe World Rugby has just got to, once every 4 years, create a bit of a window for a month, that's all. So the best rugby players in the world can go to the Olympic Games and play Sevens.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I guess the rugby will argue there is no room for this. We always hear about these congested seasons, don't we? And certainly in New Zealand here, we play Super Rugby. Then we move into the Test arena. And for the top players, there's not a hell of a lot of time off. So it would be a major change for World Rugby to do it. It'll be very interesting to see whether they do or not. But certainly Sevens has become a major component. Although having looked a bit at the Sevens circuit this year, there are certain venues where nobody shows up. And maybe they need a rethink on this one.
Well, I think in fairness to World Rugby, I think they've taken a deliberate ploy or tactic to go into underrated rugby markets to try and build the game on the strength of Sevens now being an Olympic sport. So you could probably give them some credit for that. But I, on the other hand, look at that crowd. It was 70,000 there, I think, on those 2 days of the Sevens tournament at the Olympic Games. Can you imagine, a few years back, 70,000 people going along to an Olympic stadium to watch Sevens rugby? But the fact that they did shows, I suppose, again, proof of how worldwide, how popular Sevens has become.
Yeah, absolutely. And I imagine, particularly in France and Paris with the French, one of the favourites to win the gold medal, that was a factor, wasn't it? I did watch some of the games in the first day of the women's tournament, and there was a fairly sparse crowd by comparison. It will be interesting to see when they play the gold medal, I think tonight, the rest of the competition, whether the fans turn out for the women's competition. And I guess a lot to do with how France are going in that competition. I'm not sure on the women's side how they're going. But, yes, it was a real eye-opener. It really was. It was a massive crowd.
I must confess, when rugby first was included, or the sevens included on the Olympic Games, I'm trying to think when it was it London in 2012 or Rio in 2016, I was very suspicious of the fact that it would make much inroad or make much impact. But it clearly has, hasn't it? I mean, and now rugby finds itself in this extraordinary position where the sevens game universally is probably more popular than the 15s.
Oh, look, I think you're right, actually. I mean, when you look at some of the teams that turn up at some of these sevens tournaments and you think to yourself, really? Do they play rugby there?
Yeah.
It's quite staggering, really. And I guess it all goes back, in the early days when the Wellington Sevens was hugely successful and people turned up. Teams like Kenya turned up. And you sort of thought to yourself, what sort of rugby competition do they run in Kenya? I mean, it was quite eye-opening. And when you see some of the teams that are playing in Paris this year, rugby really has, moved out of the traditional rugby nations. Places like Spain and Germany and all the rest of it. They obviously play rugby in a hell of a lot of places that you and I didn't realise.
That's right. Exactly, yeah. Well, sevens is becoming the T20 of rugby, isn't it? Rather like what T20's done to cricket. Sevens is doing it to rugby, and this is a good thing. Did you see much of the New Zealand matches a few days ago? What did you make of their performances?
Look, I only saw the final. I got up to actually watch the final, and it was pretty disappointing. Their final, which was getting knocked out by the South Africans, who they'd beaten pretty comfortably previously. They looked nervous. Certainly in that game against South Africa, they lost. There was a lot of things that they didn't do well. They didn't do the basics well. They dropped the ball a lot. They missed a few tackles, and I think they were just simply nervous. So the weight of expectation maybe from back home was too great for them, really, and they didn't look at all settled to me.
Yeah, well, it's probably understandable, I suppose, when you're sending a lot of young kids off to play in an Olympic stadium in front of 70,000 people. It's not a bad idea if you've got a few wise old hands in there. I think there probably were one or two of them there for sure. But it would have been a very intimidating experience for a lot of those young guys. I must confess, it's probably my ignorance more than anything. I didn't really recognise too many of any of those names. You probably can talk about them, but I presume they just came through the normal trial system, did they?
Well, yeah, I don't really know. I don't follow sevens quite as closely as I should, Telf. I know they've got a base in I think it's Mount Maunganui, and what I will be interested in seeing with the NPC starting, how many of these guys will come back and actually play NPC rugby, or are they completely devoted to sevens and that's it?
Well, I suppose it depends on the size of the checks they're getting for playing sevens, but they're all on separate contracts, aren't they, from 15s contracts, I presume. So probably they may not need to play provincial rugby, because I think I read somewhere recently where New Zealand Rugby Union are going to have to bite the bullet and reduce the amount of money they're putting into the salaries of provincial rugby players, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're having a look at the finances of all aspects of rugby. I don't really follow the politics of rugby too closely, I've got to say. I'm only really interested, Telf, when the whistle blows to start the game.
Okay, then.
And when the whistle blows to end the game.